and a very beautiful community. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm just on the bubble in terms of being physically well enough to do this chat, so bear with me if I struggle and stumble a bit. We're talking Peter Pomerantsev's Foreign Affairs piece, which is titled Putin's Hidden Vulnerability. To break the Kremlin's war machine, the West must exploit the grievances and fears of ordinary Russians. It is a paywalled piece, which inclines me to read more of it for you, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's easier, I think, if these videos are samples of the thing we're reading rather than the whole thing. So I'll try to balance that. Peter has a book out, his latest one, and I recommend it very much. Now, I'm a bit protective of Peter because he is one of those people who talks to us about the importance of our information environment and the importance of our information environment for democracy. And like some others in our culture, like climate communicators, that's a category of person I feel who needs to be elevated and held up. So I do have a pro-Peter bias. Peter likes the Why All Russians Are Responsible for Putin's War video on the main channel. It's a video about not guilt but political responsibility. And I think in a way the comment section of that video is quite interesting too, because it's a good example of, now the top comments are all from you, so they're good, but the rest of the comments can be sometimes an example of what I call algorithmic response. You hear the word cabbage, you respond with the word tomato. So a lot of the comments are, what about Iraq? When the video precisely says that we're all responsible for political things that our countries do, even if we're against them. Responsible doesn't mean guilty, but responsible means responsible. So the whole video is an argument that I am responsible for Iraq as a British citizen at the time. But yet, there is this algorithmic response, how about Iraq? And that's how much of our online communication goes. And that's a problem. Let's start. In early August, Peter writes, as Ukrainian forces burst across the Russian border on their way to capturing 385 square miles of Russian territory in the Kursk region, the Kremlin maintained it had everything under control. State media reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin was competently organizing relief efforts for the region's inhabitants and directing the army to crush the invaders. On social media, the mood was a little different, and people were asking what the hell is going on and what is this president up to, and is he being as competent as he should? I'm going to skip these couple of paragraphs from Peter where he points out the online commotion. And you've got to understand that you shouldn't overstate how much that represents the mood of the country. But Peter here is quoting some analyses of the Russian internet, indicating that, the number of folks who were questioning the authorities, including questioning Putin, bumped up. Peter writes, these findings point to an underlying problem in Putin's information system. From the outset of its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the government has stifled liberal media in Russia, forcing independent news organizations to either close down or move out of the country, blocking access to platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Since the war began, Putin has allowed many major pillars of the Russian state, the army, the Federal Security Service, the presidential administration, the mercenary forces, to oversee their own popular pro-war social media and especially Telegram channels, which they use to attack one another and push their own interests. In addition to promoting Kremlin policies, this allows Putin to balance power among these power centers and keep each on their toes. Now, because Peter knows Russia well, is saying something that's importantly true here, and that is Putin's old propensity to engage with conflicting elements of the regime as a referee would. And often that's involved outsourcing presidential powers to elites around him who conflict about how to use these powers between each other, and then in comes Putin to referee this conflict. So if you want to relate this to the Prigozhin situation, which Peter mentions later, what you say is that the conflict between Prigozhin and the MOD was actually an entirely natural conflict for the Putin regime. It was the kind of conflict that was not just permissible, but functional to the regime. The trouble is that under conditions of war, the type of conflict that was previously functional suddenly got out of control and produced a near revolutionary situation. Meanwhile, Peter writes, ordinary Russians get to vent some of their frustrations on social media, as long as they don't criticize the leader or the decision to wage war. We'll skip a couple of sentences and then read again. Debunking the lies, the hate speech, the incitement to genocide is morally right and crucial to establishing the truth. But challenging such concocted stories inside Russia is unlikely to undermine Putin's war machine or the regime's grip on Russian society. Instead, the key vulnerabilities in Putin's information system are about the limits of control and how that affects the regime's overall confidence in its ability to wage war. Ukraine's international partners need to understand the specific ways that information flows are organized in Russia, which agendas, media, and audiences the Kremlin thinks are important to enable its war effort, and how these relationships can be disrupted. Peter goes on. The cracks in the Kremlin's control over what Russians say and do lie along two axes. First, long-term grievances that the regime struggles to manage, and two, sudden shocks that are too complex for the propaganda system to contain. Long-term grievances that the regime struggles to manage, and sudden shocks that are too complex for the propaganda model to control. As Maria Snegovaya, who you should all follow if you're on Twitter, and indeed read elsewhere, of Georgetown University has observed, the Kremlin has consistently managed to build popular support for its wars. Now, that's an okay expression, even though strictly speaking it's epistemically questionable. We'll see why in a second. Even before the era of high censorship that exists today. For example, in September 2015, on the cusp of Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war, the Levada Center, an independent Russian polling organization, found that 69% of the population opposed providing direct military assistance to the Syrian government. Within a month, however, opinion had dramatically shifted. 72% supported the Kremlin's bombing campaign in Syria. Similarly, in 2021, only 8% of Russians thought Russia should send military troops to fight against the Ukrainian government. By February 2022, however, 68% supported Russian troops' action in Ukraine, a figure that rose to 80% in March. Now, what you have to understand is that there is no such thing as support for a particular policy in Russia outside very narrow circles, which you're going to find in a relatively small liberal bubble, and you're going to find in a relatively small hardcore pro-war bubble. And these are folks who are often critical of Putin because they do want war as Putin does, but they want a more successful and a more total war. So the reason that it's fine but not ideal to say that people didn't support Putin's actions in Syria and then did is because what we're really talking about is a depoliticized outsourcing of political decision making to the only political institution in the land with perceived legitimacy, and that's Putin. And so as Putin changes his position and it becomes visible that he has changed his position, right, so do the responses of the population change on particular policies. But it's not the case that the population had a substantive view about Syria that was one thing that then changed. That's not true. The same as the case about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's not that people had substantive views that it wasn't a good idea and then they changed their mind. It's rather that they had no views about this and they were outsourcing to Putin that political decision. And so what happened is that they were simply observing what Putin's position was, not that they were changing their mind from one thing to another. So on the doorstep, that would sound like, well, now he's doing the war. I generally support what he does. I don't know why he's doing the war, and I hope he has good reasons for it, even though I don't know what they are. So now we'll skip a bit and look at Peter talking about some of the systemic grievances the Russian population has. Peter discusses medical services and he discusses economic issues. We're skipping a little bit ahead again. Economic worries are often a forefront concern for soldiers' families too. The Kremlin is now offering extravagant salaries and signing bonuses of up to $38,000 to men who sign contracts with the army. As one recruitment poster put it, while serving your motherland for glory, you'll be able to complete house renovation and buy new appliances for your kitchen. So, in a way, much of this military recruitment is the most extraordinary expression of a kind of hyper-neoliberalism, whereby these folks are engaged in a kind of business deal with the regime. Not just because they say, well, here is the trade-off between risk of death and financial reward as I perceive it, but because people who observe them doing that don't relate to them as folks who are out to defend the country. They relate to them as folks who are engaged in a business deal. And because of that, they tend to think that they took the deal, and if it ends badly for them, so be it. That's actually a very important sort of dampener on resentment about the extent of losses at the front. That if you're talking about losses of soldiers who signed these kinds of contracts, the response that their neighbors, their fellow villagers, fellow residents in their, urban apartment blocks will have is, well, they signed the deal and it's just a business deal that went badly for them if they haven't survived. But they took the business deal, so it's just something that's between them and the state. You see the extravagant sort of level of collapse of all human relations into business transaction. So that's just a small sample of Peter talking about some of the systemic issues, right? Let's jump now to Peter talking about sudden shocks for the regime. To anyone paying attention, there is often a striking gap between calm-sounding Russian news reports and the discontent about the same developments on social media. And here Peter mentions and discusses the partial mobilization of autumn 2022, the Prigozhin mutiny, 2023 summer, and Peter says that and of course the Kursk invasion. Peter says that the Prigozhin episode showed how easily Kremlin's propaganda machine can just jam, and that when it does, Russia's various arms of power will not rush to the president's aid, waiting instead for their chance to pounce. The country was briefly institutionally lost during the Prigozhin mutiny, partly because people were waiting to see what will happen, but mainly because people were waiting to see how Putin would respond so that they can fall in line. The Kursk invasion is the most recent of such shocks. Now, I am somebody who lowers the significance of the Kursk invasion as a disruptive factor in the short term, even though it is absolutely toxic for a country to normalize losing possession of its territory and pretend it's not a problem. So that's absolutely toxic for the Russian state's capacity to maintain its monopoly over organized violence in the long term and to maintain indeed its territorial integrity in the long term. But in the short term, I'm an anti-alarmist on Kursk, largely because even though Peter rightly quoted some evidence to the contrary, I don't see most Russians being particularly moved by it, and I see a special calm in the Kremlin about it. I mean, the key question they always ask is this an existential threat to us or is it not? And of course, an existential threat to Russia in their view just is an existential threat to them. So if you take Russian territory, but they don't perceive it as an existential threat, they don't regard it as an existential threat to Russia. So there was a special calm in the Kremlin about this, actually, relative to what it actually is, right? Which is another country taking control of your territory. That we wouldn't be calm about if it happened to us. And it's also the case that I think that they've been thinking all along, because they tend to think they're winning the war. It's not obvious that they're wrong either. But they tend to think they're winning the war. And because of that, they thought that on balance, this move will just play into their hands anyway. It'll disadvantage Ukraine more than it advantages Ukraine in the medium term. That Ukraine might galvanize some short-term political advantages from it, perhaps some further disinhibitions on use of weapons from the West, perhaps some kind of demonstration that Ukraine has not just the capacity to fight on, but the capacity to surprise. But in the medium term, they thought that they're going to gain military advantage from this and that they are not going to lose much politically. It may be tempting to conclude, Peter writes, that Putin's strongman rule is impervious to temporary dips in manipulating public discourse and behavior. But even in Russia, these shifts are important because they show that the state is not able to control society at will. Consider the weird ritual of elections, despite the fact that everyone knows Putin will win. As Stephen Holmes and Ivan Krastev argued, as early as 2012, the Kremlin relies on blatant voter fraud and on instructing state employees how to vote. The aim is not to convince anyone that these elections are free and fair, but to show that the government is capable of rigging them and that it has the power to get the country to play along in the farce. Yes. And also, however, elections are a legitimating ritual that are there to demonstrate that Putin has the people behind him constitutively. It's a demonstration of that to the people themselves. It's a demonstration of that to Putin, by Putin. And it's a demonstration of that to any opponents Putin might have. And it's a demonstration of that to Putin's elite. Because he's saying to them, look, if you try to question me, all I need to do is step aside. Step sideways, rather, not step aside from the throne, and then you will see behind me the Russian people, from whom I am inseparable. And then you're going to be in real trouble, because you'll know that you're basically going against the country if you're going against me. So it is a very important ritual that is meant to primarily affirm, actually, the fact that Putin has the support not just of the majority of the people, but increasingly, and this is where I believe we're moving, that Putin has the unanimous support of the Russian people. Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski argued in September that if the West wants to stop Russia, it needs to change Putin's calculations about the risks and costs he faces at home for waging the war now and waging new ones in the future. Well, that's politics, that's political speech. And it's aspirational political speech. The reality is that if Putin were to stop the war, in my opinion, this is just an analysis, not a fact, his domestic situation would be intolerably more dangerous than it is now. Peter goes on, the problem confronting Ukraine and its partners in trying to reach ordinary Russians is not unlike the challenge faced by the UK toward the citizens of Nazi Germany in World War II. And Peter gives wonderful discussion of this, and you can also read more of Peter in the book. And I'm going to skip this very interesting section. Confounding the Kremlin. This is really the final section, the centerpiece of Peter's piece. Like their British counterparts 80 years ago, Ukraine's Western allies also need to refocus the way they harness the information environment against the enemy. To the extent that there are any Western-backed communication efforts into Putin's Russia, they largely engage the country's small population of liberals and follow the logic of classic Western journalism. By challenging the Kremlin's lies and false narratives about the war, this work keeps the flame of truth alight and is a wise investment for the future, helping develop a post-imperial vision of Russia that doesn't define itself by enslaving and dominating others. But to actively undermine Russia's war machine now, Kiev and its partners will need to launch more targeted communication efforts. Firstly, Europe and the United States need to find ways to exploit and exacerbate Putin's lack of control, particularly at moments of heightened disorder. Coming on the heels of Kursk, another such shock, such as suddenly granting Ukraine the right to strike targets in Russia, causing a new wave of uncertainty throughout the country, might have put Putin in a situation in which it felt it was losing, the Kremlin, in a situation in which it felt it was losing its hold over Russian society. Ambitious. There are many other kinds of moves that could create similar shocks. Unlike the complex choices surrounding military actions and authorizations, informational initiatives bear little risk of leading to direct military escalation. Indeed, Russia has itself long exploited this fact by attacking democracies through information warfare, recognizing that there is little the West can do to respond. While the United States and its European partners do not need to imitate Russia's use of disinformation, they too can profit from this non-military strategy. New research on Kremlin efforts to manage what Russians say and do during the war suggests a range of potential topics for public information campaigns into the country. One concerns the army and families of soldiers, surfacing issues about financial compensation for those killed in action. Imagine if, during the recent Kursk incursion, Ukraine and its allies had already established a major communication channel aimed at Russian soldiers and their families, as the British radio broadcasts did with German soldiers in the Second World War. It could have been used to decrease morale and encourage defections at a moment of panic. Such a project could also include discrete channels aimed at different branches of the Russian system: the Federal Security Service, the police, the army, the mercenary soldiers. Another focus could be on issues of perennial concern to the general population, such as healthcare and the economy. By continually understanding the Kremlin's control over what people say and do, undermining the Kremlin's control over what people say and do, such efforts could make the Russian leadership less confident in its ability to contain the domestic costs of its foreign policy. We're almost there, and I'll give my analytical reaction. For maximum effect, any sustained information campaign should be connected to the broader economic, diplomatic and military strategies and coordinated between Ukraine and its allies. And we'll come back to this at the end, because that's probably the most important sentence of the piece. For maximum effort, we'll repeat it, any sustained information campaign should be connected to the broader economic, diplomatic and military strategies and coordinated between Ukraine and its allies. The Ukrainians are fighting for their lives and can take the lead on the most subversive communication efforts connected to their own military actions. In turn, larger allies like the UK and the US can assist with public diplomacy, research, timely policies, and information about military assistance and economic statecraft, as well as reorienting communication channels to target ordinary mainstream Russians rather than the liberal audiences reached by most current initiatives. Frontline states in the Baltics can focus on border regions of Russia, which have taken the greatest economic hit for the war. There's a role for civil society too. Governments no longer dominate the means of communication as they did in the Second World War. Some of the most innovative campaigns can come from private sector activists, although these will be more effective if their independent activity aligns with a broader strategy. Final paragraph now. So far, however, the US and its European allies have failed to take advantage of the Kremlin's structural vulnerabilities. Instead, they tend to remain in a reactive mode, preoccupied with red lines and fears of Russian escalation. During each of the major shocks that have struck the Kremlin since the war started, they have stepped back and let Moscow recalibrate, recover, and come back even stronger. This is what is happening now with the Kursk offensive. After a few weeks of panic, the Kremlin appears to be getting its propaganda strategy back in order, telling Russians to be calm and not await any speedy liberation of the region. As it doubles down on its assault in the Donbass, the Kremlin is glad to have the Kursk problem fade from view. Ukraine's allies cannot afford to squander the next time Russian propaganda system is thrown into confusion when its seeming total control slips to reveal the incompetence and apathy underneath. Thank you so much, Peter. Now my response, of which I've made a note because I shared it a little bit on Twitter. First, Peter is basically correct. We can do so much more informationally to destabilize the Putin regime. Second point. However, for a more than marginal impact, we need politicization. A picture of what we want to see on the Russian space translated into practical messages that appeal to Russian institutions and demographics, from the army to the security agencies. And Peter was describing some of this. But there's a difference between doing this in a piecemeal way and doing this in connection with a strategy for European security, a strategy for the Russian space and the Belarusian space. And this is what Peter is talking about when he says, for maximum effort, sustained information campaigns should be connected to broader economic, diplomatic and military strategies. So, for example, I say, just go back a little bit. So we need politicization. We need a picture of what we want to see on the Russian space translated into practical messages that appeal to Russian institutions and demographics, from the army to the security services. Politicization requires both critique and positive proposals. For an example of critique without positive proposals, see Prigozhin himself. Prigozhin's own discourse. So Prigozhin's discourse was negatively successful because his message was about incompetence. Look at all of these fools in power here. Whatever they try their hand at, they fail. They try to do a war, they can't do it. If they try to stop the war, I bet they'll be terrible at that. Whatever they try their hand at, they can't do. And that was a message that almost disconcertingly mimicked some of Navalny's discourse, right? But was even more compelling at transcending particular sort of limitations of appeal. It could genuinely speak to anybody. It could speak to a Navalny supporter. It could speak to a Z radical, that message. The problem, however, for Prigozhin was he offered nothing constructive. He didn't offer a blueprint for the future of the Russian army. He didn't offer a 10-point blueprint for the future of Russia as a country. If he'd done that, it could have been either a different outcome or at least a much more dangerously revolutionary situation. Third point. Now, Peter doesn't elaborate much on the Russian opposition. He mentions the work of Maria Snegovaya, who recently argued that the Russian liberal opposition are not a significant political force. Now, I largely agree. However, I don't think their insignificance is constitutive. They are politically insignificant because they are depoliticized and do not practice politics. But any attempt to politicize the Russian space would require us to politicize the Russian opposition. What would it look like in practice? And here I'm being quite facetious. It would look like this. Dear Navalny team, dear Mr. Khodorkovsky, dear Maxim Katz, release a plan for the future of a Russian demographic or a Russian institution like the FSB or the army, addressed to the army. And in this plan, outline how you'll guarantee Russia's security interests in the future, how Putin is just obliterating Russia's security interests, and how you'll make the institution of the army prosper. Now listen to how that sounds, right? Compared to the discourse you often find pushed upon Russians and pushed upon the Russian opposition online, which is tell the Russians they're terrible, tell the Russians they're evil. Well, that's not effective because they already feel terrible about themselves, most Russians, and telling them how terrible they are is just going to make them even more passive. So what you tell them is that there is another way, and here it is, and it's being proposed to you not just by people who are having some kind of private chat with a small liberal bubble, but they're speaking to the whole country, right? So tell Mr. Navalny, tell Mr. Khodorkovsky, tell Mr. Katz to release a video and a plan for the future of the Russian army. And, that's politicization, right? And because you haven't empathized enough with the task of a more effective Russian opposition than the real one, you might be shocked by the fact that what they need to do is release videos titled Make the Russian Army Great Again, right? But that's real politics, real change, right? Rather than the sort of frivolous virtue signaling that pretends that perhaps Russia doesn't need an army because its army has misbehaved, right? There's no space for that in reality. 4, politicization of the Russian space requires a strategy in the war and a clear vision of European security. The West doesn't have that. What stops the West developing such strategic vision is democratic decline. So I believe that this is an absence of strategic vision secondary to democratic incapacity at home. 5, my final point. politicization of the Russian space requires not just a Western strategy, but a Western strategy shared in common with Ukraine. However, like the West, Ukraine is not in a position to propose a strategy for the West to follow, for European security, for what should happen on the Russian and Belarusian space. Now, this is genuinely hard for Ukraine, as it is dependent on a strategy-poor West. But for all the justified critique of the depoliticization of the Russian liberal opposition, both Ukraine and us, Western powers, are themselves in a depoliticized predicament when it comes to strategic proposals for European security and a vision for what should happen on the Belarusian and Russian space. So in a cartoonish way, what am I really saying? I'm saying that Peter is right, and what he's arguing for is excellent, but you can only do a couple of ladlefuls of it without politicization. Now, that doesn't mean that politicization is possible. It just means it's desirable. I actually believe it is limitedly possible because you're going to run up to a certain kind of ceiling, which is the ceiling of a West stuck in democratic decline and stuck in global strategic retreat. But that's not to say that we can't do more toward politicizing, right? So that's an important, if you like, footnote and complement that I'm adding to Peter's piece, for which I'm grateful. And I'm so grateful for your time with me as well. Lots and lots of love.